Everybody, shalom. It's good to see you all. Baruch Hashem, I think legally, at least outside, I think the mask restrictions have been lifted, and we hope, as Ras Hashem, that we've turned a major corner, and there should be refuah to the world. As I mentioned last week, the whole month of Iyar is connected to the idea of refuah. Iyar, Aleph is Ani, Yud is Hashem's name, and the Resh is Rofecha. I am the God, Hashem says, who heals you. And that's connected to the month of Iyar, so Ken Yehi Ratzon. Tonight's share is sponsored once again by a very good friend of mine, Yosef Kalimi, in appreciation of the Shiurim. And as has been the case, Refuah Shlema for number one, Binyamin Yisrael ben Chanita, the young man that we've been praying for a long time. Chaya Shifra bat Galila Yocheved, and Galila Yocheved bat Devora. So for all of them, we wish them a refuah shlema b'toch shar cholei Yisrael, and may the learning and the Torah that we say tonight and the other shiurim that Yibaneh gives should all be for a refuah shlema for them and for all of the cholei Amo Yisrael. You know that we're doubling up on Parshiot, just like last week was a double Parsha, Tazria Mitzorah. This week is also a double Parsha, Acharei Mos and Kedoshim. The reason why you have this doubling is because in a leap year, it's really the other way around. In a leap year, you got to split them. In a leap year, you have extra Shabbatot, so as a result, we split the Parshios. When you don't have a leap year, you're 4 weeks short. So you combine things that would otherwise be separate. Why certain parshiot are chosen for chibur and certain parshiot are not is actually very interesting and difficult astronomical question, which I will not get into now. But we do have a double parsha, and as a result, there's quite a lot to talk about. I actually have one thought connected to Acharei Mos and another thought connected to Kedoshim. I'm not sure I'll get to the Kedoshim thought, but if not, I can carry it over because it's also connected to Emor as well. So in a way, there are common themes throughout many of these parshios. But this parsha, the first of the two parshiot, Acharei Mos, begins that Hashem commanded Moshe, Acharei Mos, after the death of the two sons of Aaron, who, when they tried to draw near, they suffered a death. These are Aaron's two oldest children, Nadav and Avihu. We actually read the story of their death a few weeks ago, but here there's a reference that Hashem gave a whole bunch of commandments, and the Torah emphasizes Acharei Mos b'nei Aaron. Now, the substance of the commandments that are given in Acharei Mos is essentially the Yom Kippur service. In point of fact, the first half of Acharei Mos is the Kriyas HaTorah of Yom Kippur morning, and it describes the idea of the Kohen Gadol going into the Holy of Holies once a year, the different korbanos, the two uniforms that the Kohen Gadol has, that when he goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he is wearing pure white linen with no gold, but then when he goes out, he switches to a gold garment, or a garment that contains gold thread, because when you're in the Holy of Holies and you're seeking mercy for the Jewish people, you don't bring anything to do with the kid of the golden calf. That's the famous saying, Ein kateger nasa sanegor, that the prosecutor cannot be a good defense attorney. So that's why the Kohen Gadol goes back and forth between the white uniform and the gold uniform, the white uniform in the Holy of Holies, which he enters 4 different times on Yom Kippur. And then we have what he does outside, where he wears the golden garments. And it essentially goes through the whole Yom Kippur service, really from the beginning to the end. The multiple immersions in the mikveh, the multiple washings of the hands and the feet, the switching of the gold to the white and the white to the gold, all of the different korbanos of Yom Kippur. And remember, Yom Kippur was a bit unique because everything had to be done by the Kohen Gadol. That's very, very unique. The rest of the year, the Kohen Gadol actually never had to officiate. If he wanted to, he could, but he left it to the other Kohanim. Yom Kippur, he does everything. And when I say everything, I don't just mean he does the special Yom Kippur stuff, But even the stuff that is also done during the rest of the year, the Korban Tamid, the daily offering of the morning and the afternoon, the daily incense of the morning and the afternoon, the lighting of the menorah, these are not Yom Kippur services. These are the services that were done every day, including Yom Kippur, and it had to be done by the Kohen Gadol. The Yom Kippur service itself is a very, very fascinating topic that we could easily spend 2 or 3 hours on. But I want to maybe focus on a more preliminary technical question, and that is, why is the tzivoy of the Avodas Yom Kippur so linked to the deaths of Aaron's 2 children? There seems to be kind of a causal relationship here. God gave these commandments acharei mos Shnei B'nai Aaron. What's the connection between the Yom Kippur service and the deaths of the 2 children of Aaron that should trigger all of these rules? And the short answer is because essentially the Yom Kippur service is based on the notion of boundaries, of not trying to go to the holy places when you're not yet ready to do so. That's what it says. Al yavo b'chol eis El HaKodesh. Aaron and all Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol is commanded, do not enter the Holy of Holies whenever you feel like doing it. Rather, there are boundaries, there are restrictions. There's a time, there's a place, there's a ritual. Nadav and Avihu, and this is what I'm going to explore actually, died because they did not have a sense of boundary and containment. And that's really what I want to talk about, and that is why it is the segue to the Yom Kippur restrictions. Al yavo b'chol es el HaKodesh. Now remember the chronology here. The Mishkan itself was dedicated on the 1st of Nisan. Right? For 7 days before that, Moshe Rabbeinu was putting it up and taking it down every single day. And actually Moshe was officiating as the Kohen. But on the Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the Mishkan is put up to remain permanent, at least until it's moved to the next location. And that was a day of great joy, a great day of great simcha. A day that is as lofty, the Gemara says, as the day of the creation of heaven and earth. Tremendous joy. The Shekhinah came down and rested amongst Bnei Yisrael. As Hashem promised, Asuli Mikdash, make for me a sanctuary, V'shachanti b'tocham, and I will dwell not only in the sanctuary, I will dwell in their midst, in their heart and their soul. And in the middle of that great simcha, the Torah says that the 2 children of Aaron, the oldest children, Aaron had 4 sons, the 2 oldest are Nadav and Avihu. And they took an Eish Zara. They took a strange fire. Asher lo tzuva b'hem, that they were not commanded to take. I'm just quoting or paraphrasing the pasuk here. They took a strange fire for which they were not commanded. Vateitze Eish milifnei Hashem. And a fire came out from God and consumed them. And they died on this happiest, greatest joy of all days, was marred by the tragic death of Nadav and Avihu. The Gemara actually explains that this was an unusual type of death. The fire entered their body and burnt up their neshama, but the body itself was not mutilated. The body itself was whole. And then we have the immortal words in the Torah that when Aaron saw the loss of his 2 oldest children, Vayidam Aaron, Aaron was silent. Didn't complain. Didn't say why. He accepted. He understood in ways that really are beyond our madrega. That whatever God does is right, is good. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Right? It doesn't mean that you don't suffer, but you understand that it is what it had to be. And indeed, the Torah goes on and says, on that very day, Aaron and his two other sons, Elazar and Isamar, who survived, were actually commanded not to engage in mourning rituals. They were commanded not even to mourn, at least on that day, because they had a job to do for the dedication of the Mishkan. Now, the problem here is, though, that what exactly Nadav and Avihu did is very obscure. The Torah says they took a strange fire, or a foreign fire, Eish Zara. What exactly is their Aveira? Now, the simple interpretation, this is just the simplest interpretation, is this. The Torah describes that when the Mishkan was dedicated, and there's a Mizbech, there's an altar, a fire came down from heaven and ignited the wood on the Mizbeach miraculously. Now, when the incense is supposed to be sacrificed on the golden Mizbeach, the coals are supposed to be taken from the outer Mizbeach. So the fire that should have been taken is the heavenly fire on the Mizbeach. But Nadav and Avihu wanted to bring Ketores with their own fire, so they brought in, quite literally, a fire from a source other than the divine fire of the Mizbeach. That was an Eish Zara. So Mida Keneged Mida, right? They're rebelling against Hashem with a fire that they shouldn't bring in. Hashem retaliates with a fire. Now that is the most literal interpretation of Eish Zara. Others understand that they brought their fire into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which actually ties in with Acharei Mos. That's why Hashem is saying, be sure not to do that again, because you see what happened the first time. But there's a problem that all of these explanations of Eish Zara, which are what the words say, is not the Aveira that Rashi identifies and many Mamari Chazal identify. Rashi says, again, Rashi got it from the Medrash, that the sin of Nadav and Avihu was they entered the Mishkan after drinking some wine or intoxicating beverage. And a Kohen, or anyone, is not allowed to enter the Mishkan or later the Beis HaMikdash. Again, I'm not going to say in a state of intoxication because we assume they weren't drunk, but even drinking a revius of wine, which is only 4 ounces, that already says you can't enter. Now the proof that Rashi gives is a bit of a perplexing proof, because Rashi says that's why right after the death of Nadav and Avihu, God commands the Kohanim not to drink when they go into the Mishkan. Now wait a second here. Those of you that are students of the U.S. Constitution may remember a well-known clause that Congress cannot pass what's called an ex post facto law. An ex post facto law is they can't criminalize something after you've already done the act. You did something that was legal. The government wants to get you, so they then pass a law that what you did was illegal. Well, that's not fair. At the time, there was no prohibition. They can make a law that from now on, somebody that does something is going to be punished. But they can't pass a law to punish you for something that was not illegal at the time. That's called an ex post facto law. So, one second here. Rashi says, Nadav and Avihu died because they drank wine, but the prohibition against drinking wine was given as a consequence to their death. So how could that be the reason that they were punished? That's one question. Another question is, how do you reconcile that with Eish Zara? The Torah doesn't give that reason. The Torah gives the reason of Eish Zara, foreign fire. It's not the reason. And not only that, but if you look at the Medrash, and Rashi does not bring all of these opinions, there's a whole laundry list of sins that Nadav and Avihu did. So we have Rashi that says they drank wine or intoxicating drink. That's one Aveira. Another Aveira was they didn't get married. They decided not to get married because they thought nobody's good enough for them. A third Aveira that's mentioned is they used to paskin halacha in the presence of Moshe and Aaron, and that's not proper to do that. You don't paskin in the presence of your Rebbe. A fourth Aveira, I'm losing count here, is that they were actually hoping, or they would actually say to themselves at least, when will Moshe and Aaron, these old people, die so we can take over the leadership? And another Aveira was that they were not wearing all of the Big Day Kahuna. A Kohen has to wear all of the Kohanic garments, and they were not wearing all of them. And another Aveira was that really they were Chayav Misa all the way back at Matan Torah. Because if you remember in Parshas Mishpatim, it talks about the elders who saw a vision of God sitting on his sapphire throne. And they were gazing at Hashem, whatever that means. And they were eating and drinking. And according to some Midrashim, that was Nadav and Avihu. And they were Chayav Misa at the time of Matan Torah. But Hashem didn't want to kill them because he didn't want to mar the joy of Matan Torah. So he awaited until the day of the Mishkan. Very difficult. So why would Hashem want to mar the day of the dedication of the Mishkan? Okay. And yet a final Aveira, so many Aveiras, so I'll reiterate them afterwards, was...
Different opinions, or there's an opinion they violated all of them?
No, these seem to be different opinions. Is that really Nadav and Avihu died because of Aaron's sin in building the golden calf. And really, Aaron and all four of his sons should have died. But Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer annulled half of the decree, actually more than half of the decree. So 2 sons survived and 2 sons died. So again, look at the number of at least possible Aveiros that Chazal identify. We have drinking wine. We have paskening halacha in front of Moshe. We have not getting married. Paskening halacha in front of Moshe and Aaron. Wishing for Moshe and Aaron to die. Not wearing Big Day Kahuna. The chait of gazing at the Shekhinah at Matan Torah. And finally, it wasn't even their sin, it was Aaron's sin of the Chet Egel, for which Moshe Rabbeinu's prayer only took off part of the Gezerah. So 2 died and 2 survived. Now, here's the problem. You're giving me every possible Aveira except for the Aveira that the Torah itself says. The Torah says it was Eish Zara, a foreign fire. So you're giving me a million other Aveiras? What about the fact? And the one thing that the Gemara or the Medrash does not say as an Aveira was the Aveira of Eish Zara. So what's going on? Why are you giving all of these different Aveiras? Hold that question. We'll come back to it.
So the Gemara doesn't say Eish Zara? Who doesn't say Eish Zara?
Well, when the Medrash enumerates all of the Aveiras, it doesn't enumerate Eish Zara as an Aveira, but that's what the Chumash says. So hold that question. We'll come back to it. But I first want to address the preliminary question of the ex post facto law. Let's take Rashi without looking at Eish Zara. Rashi says the Aveira was they drank, and indeed Hashem said after they died, anyone that drinks and goes into the Mishkan is Chayav Misa. Okay, that's fine. But how could that be the basis to make them Chayav Misa if that prohibition was not given till after they did it and died? How can that be the reason for their death? So the answer has to be, just answering that question, is that even though the commandment wasn't given yet, they should have understood it on their own because of their level of holiness, and therefore they could be held accountable for that which they should have understood, even if we could not be accountable until there's a commandment. Because in many, many ways, if you think about it, the prohibition of not drinking wine and going into the Mishkan is not intuitively obvious. Because we recognize the importance of wine in generating joy in religious ceremonies. We use wine in religious ceremonies. We use wine for Kiddush. We use wine for the 4 cups to celebrate freedom. We use wine at a bris, at a pidyon haben, at a sheva brachos, at a chasana. Right? So wine is something that augments joy in the fulfillment of mitzvahs. This is what the pasuk says in Tehillim. David HaMelech says, Yayin yisamach levav enosh. Wine has the capacity to give a person joy. So one might have thought, you're going to the Beis HaMikdash. You're going to be serving God. It is the day of dedication. Let us celebrate with a toast. Let us celebrate with a kiddush. Let us celebrate with a bracha. So it wasn't intuitively obvious that this is a bad thing. But because Nadav and Avihu were so righteous, they should have understood that the joy of the moment was so sublime that it didn't need to be generated by artificial stimulants. Utilization of an artificial stimulant means the experience itself is not pushing you high enough. So if anyone else would have done it prior to God forbidding it, it wouldn't have been a sin. For them it was a sin, and now that we have the mitzvah, for us it's a sin that the Beis HaMikdash itself should elevate us to a certain state of joy. So in this connection, I want to share with you a very interesting Mishnah in the 8th perek of Maseches Brachos. And in the 8th perek of Maseches Brachos, it is recorded a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. What is the order of Kiddush Friday night? Beit Shammai actually says, and we don't follow Beit Shammai, of course, first you make the bracha on Shabbos, the long bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Shabbos, and then after you make the bracha of Shabbos, you make Borei Pri Hagafen and drink the wine. So according to Beit Shammai, the order of Kiddush is the bracha of Shabbos and then the bracha of wine. Beis Hillel differs. And we of course follow Beis Hillel. We first make the bracha of the wine. We don't drink the wine yet, but we make the bracha over the wine, and then we make the bracha over Shabbos. As is usually the case 99% of the time, when there is an argument between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, we follow Beis Hillel. Now, there are different reasons the Gemara gives, but in Sifrei Chasidus, they offer the following fascinating explanation as to what is the basis of the machlokas, Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. We know as a general rule, Beit Shammai is strict and Beis Hillel tends to be more lenient. That's the general tendency. The Mekubalim explain that is because Shammai and Hillel, and then their respective Talmidim, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, those are the yeshivos, their neshamos are rooted in different aspects of God's infinity. Beit Shammai is rooted in God's midas hadin, attribute of justice. And that is why he is stricter. He follows the strict law. Beis Hillel is rooted in God's attribute of mercy and chesed. Now, I want to explain what that means. This is not a self-conscious thing. It's not like Beis Shammai got up every morning thinking, how can I make life harder for people? And Beis Hillel says, how can I make life easier for you? That's not the way it works. Anyone that is honest and conscientious is looking for truth. And you're looking at something objectively what is right. But Kabbalistically, what you perceive as truth is connected to what your neshama is connected to in God's infinite mitzias. The person whose shayrish haneshama, the root of your neshama, is connected to midas harachamim, will tend to see emes on the side of compassion. And the person whose neshama is rooted in midat hadin will tend to see emes in the side of strictness. Now, who's right? Now remember this. The Gemara says, when God originally wanted to create the world, he originally wanted to create the world with the attribute of strict justice. You do an Aveira, you get zapped with lightning. You do good things, you get $1 million. Justice, truth. But that's why it says, Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, Elokim, that's the Midah of Din, was going to create the world. But what happened? God had second thoughts, whatever that exactly means. And he says, he saw, the world could not survive on strict din. We mess up too much. Therefore, Hashem combined Rachamim and Din, and that's why later it doesn't say Elokim created the world, it says Hashem Elokim. Hashem is Yud Kei Vav Kei, Midah of Rachamim. So in a sense, it turns out, Midas Hadin is the ideal world, the way the world really should be. Rachamim is the imperfect realization of that ideal because of human fallibility. It's Kavyachol, God's concession to the imperfections of human nature. So we can look at it this way. Beit Shammai is an idealist. Beit Shammai is using halacha to promulgate the ideal way the world should be. And Beis Hillel is a pragmatist, looking at the imperfection of the world as it actually is. And the halacha is like Beis Hillel, because you got to be real. You got to look at the world the way it is. But that's why the Arizal writes, when Mashiach comes, the Arizal says this, the halacha is going to be like Beit Shammai. Because when the world reaches a higher and more spiritual level, we will be able to live on the standards of the way the world should have been. Okay, so again, it's a very, very deep explanation as to the idea that Beit Shammai is rooted in God's original plan for creation. And Beis Hillel is rooted in the accommodation that God made due to human weakness and imperfection. Now you may think, okay, that's great. What does that have to do with the order of Kiddush? So listen to this. We know that Shabbos is a day of great spirituality and holiness. On Shabbos we are given the gift of the Neshama Yesera, the extra soul. And Rashi says in Maseches Beitza that the extra soul on Shabbos is why you can eat more on Shabbos, because you're eating for two. Now, at first glance, that sounds a little trivial. I mean, the whole Neshama Yesera is I can eat extra cake. And unfortunately, the Neshama Yesera doesn't take away the calories when it leaves at the end. But some commentaries say that when Rashi talks about an extra capacity to eat and drink, he means soul food, not physical food. And by soul food, I don't mean collard greens and fried chicken or whatever they serve in Harlem. But soul food means that which really feeds your soul. Love of God, reverence of God, words of Torah. So when we say on Shabbos we can eat more, that actually means we have an enhanced and enlarged capacity to open our hearts to Kedusha. Now I need to emphasize, this is a capacity. That means it's a potential. It's not a done deal. It doesn't mean we will experience this every Shabbos. Sometimes we won't. We have to work on it. We have to access that potential. We have to realize that potential, right? So something, just like when Chazal say, he who prepares on Erev Shabbat will eat on Shabbos. Famous saying. Now, on one hand, that's literal. If you don't either buy your food or cook your food or at least wangle yourself an invitation on Friday, you may not have a place to eat on Shabbos. That's true. But it's also true for soul food. You want your soul to eat the spirituality of Shabbos, you got to prepare before Shabbos a little bit. Shira Shirim, whatever it would be, various meditation. That's why many people have a custom. They try to be ready for Shabbos in the middle of Friday afternoon. So there's a spirit of peace that descends instead of the last-minute rush that is so characteristic of how we often have to prepare for Shabbos. Again, it's been noted many, many times that somehow there's always last-minute rushes. I mean, when Shabbos is 7 p.m., it's a rush, and when Shabbos is 4 p.m., it's a rush. Now, if you could be ready in the winter at 4, then why can't you be ready in the summer at 4? Why does it get stretched out until 7? But that's human nature. The work, I think it's one of those Murphy's laws, or one of those laws. Work expands to fill the time allotted to it. More time, the work just gets bigger. But whatever it is. So Shabbos is a day of sublime spirituality. But at the same time, Shabbos is also a day of physical indulgence. We eat better on Shabbos. We make meals, etc. We have festive wine. People take, extra sleeping on Shabbos, etc. Shina b'Shabbos Tainik, sleeping on Shabbos. I remember when I was in 9th grade, when I came to Ner Yisrael Yeshiva in Baltimore, and kids don't sleep. So I remember the first time I came as a 14-year-old. So Shabbos afternoon, everything was dead. Everybody went to sleep. And I was going crazy. I was just wandering the halls. Nothing's happening here. Where did everybody go? After a few weeks, then I picked up the habit of sleeping on Shabbos. But the problem is, you see, so Shabbos is kind of a contradictory day. A day of Ruchnius. A day of Gashmius. Which is it? And what's the relationship between the physical and the spiritual? What's the relationship between my neshama striving to be connected to God and my body that has needs and pleasures and enjoyments for food and for wine and for sleep? So, Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel will look at it in two different ways, based on the idealist versus the pragmatist. The idealist would say, the way the world should be is, I am so overwhelmed with the joy of spirituality that I want to celebrate by wine and cholent and good food. In other words, the physical celebration is a consequence of the spiritual joy. It is the ruchnius that generates the gashmius. That's how an idealist looks at it. I'm not eating because I want the cholent. I'm eating because it is a way that I celebrate the holiness and greatness of Shabbos. So based on that paradigm, that's why Beit Shammai says, first you make the bracha on the Shabbos, and then you make the bracha on the wine, because the wine is coming because of the Shabbos. That's Beit Shammai. Beis Hillel would say this, ideally, that's the way it should be. I should be so overwhelmed with spiritual joy that I want to celebrate in a physical way. But realistically, human nature often works the other way. The thing that really excites me is, wow, the wine, the cholent, the chicken soup, the gefilte fish, wow, the beautiful table. And because I get so much pleasure from those physical things, I appreciate the holiness of Shabbos too. In other words, it's a reversal of the cause and effect. According to Beis Shammai, it is the spiritual joy that connects you to the physicality. According to Beis Hillel, it is the physicality and the pleasure of the guf that can ultimately inspire your neshama. So once again, in this machlokes, we have the idealist versus the pragmatist. Now, Nadav and Avihu were very, very righteous people. In fact, Moshe tells Aaron, they're holier than us. Therefore, they should have lived on the level of Beit Shammai, where the spirituality itself is what inspires you. But instead, they were living on the level of Beis Hillel, where I need the wine to feel the joy. And Hashem was taiveya them. Hashem punished them, because they were using the physical to bring them to the spiritual joy, when in fact the spiritual joy should have been self-sufficient. In other words, you could almost say that Nadav and Avihu should have lived on a messianic plane, and they were living on an earthly plane, and that's why they were punished, lefi their madrega. It's kind of reminiscent of a story. A chassid once said to his Rebbe, he says, Rebbe, it's a chutzpah question a little bit, why are you different than me? I get hungry, and so I take a banana and I make a bracha, and you get hungry, and you take a banana and you take a bracha. What's the difference? So the Rebbe said, you're 100% right. You get hungry and you eat, and I get hungry and I eat. But the difference is, what am I hungry for? What are you hungry for? You are hungry for the banana. I gotta have a banana. Elamai, I'm not allowed to eat without a bracha, so I make a bracha in order to eat a banana. I'm the opposite. I don't care about the banana. But I get hungry. I want to say a bracha to Hashem. But Nebuch, there's a law, you can't make a blessing in vain. So I gotta eat the banana in order to be able to make the bracha. So the difference is, are you making a bracha to eat the banana? Or are you eating the banana so you'll be able to make a bracha? What's the relationship between the physical and the spiritual? So that's point one about the drinking of the wine. But point two is, we have this laundry list of averos once again, and the question is, how do all of these averos relate to Eish Zara? And the short answer has to be that they are a commentary on Eish Zara, meaning they're not replacing Eish Zara, but they are explaining that Eish Zara can be understood in a metaphorical way. How is that? We know that Eish is often a symbol of passion, of excitement, of commitment. We talk about Eish HaTorah. Again, it's a wonderful, well, just as Or Sameach happens to be a wonderful name, it's my yeshiva, but Eish HaTorah, the fire of Torah. Understand what that means? Fire reaches upward. It represents passion, excitement, enthusiasm. As a general rule, being filled with the fire of Torah is a wonderful quality, provided it doesn't turn into the fire of machlokes and hatred. It could turn into something bad. But in terms of a fiery enthusiasm, that's a wonderful thing. Right? When you meet somebody that's filled with enthusiasm, that's very moving and even contagious. Eish. So, Nadav and Avihu had an Eish. They had a passion for spirituality. But here's the problem. You will often find that when people are very passionate about spirituality and they yearn for a relationship with God, they don't have patience for the details of halacha that they regard as an impediment in the spirituality of that relationship. You know, you can give a million examples like this. In other words, to use a fancy term, and I actually talked a little bit about this before Pesach, there is an antinomian tendency in the mystical spiritual temperament. Antinomian is simply a fancy word that means against law, against regulation, against detail, against rules. I want to embrace God. I want to be connected to God. What difference does it make if I rip my toilet paper on Shabbos or not? What difference does it make if I say Shema by 9 o'clock or 9:05? Isn't the only important thing to love Hashem and to revere Hashem? Why do I need to preoccupy myself with all of these rules? Now, historically, let me remind you, this was actually the major controversy between the Vilna Gaon and the early generations of Hasidus. Again, it's a little bit of a shrouded mystery, but what was going on in not the Baal Shem Tov himself, but some of the followers, is that they were not paying attention. Again, I'm not referring to everybody. I'm referring to certain groups within early Hasidus. They were not paying attention to all of these laws. They were basically saying the most important thing is feeling, emotion, passion. Who cares if you do the rule exactly this way or exactly that way? And that is what the Torah calls a fire that is foreign because it is not based on God's commandments. It's a passion for godliness, a passion for spirituality, but it's not circumscribed by the details of halakha. And I'll show you how each of the averos is symptomatic of that type of flaw. Essentially, Nadav and Avihu were antinomians. They were spiritual libertarians. They basically felt we can have a relationship with God that is not based on halakha. Halakha might be the rules that regular people have to follow who are not capable of a true relationship with God. So we give them rituals, we give them things to follow. But we can have the pure relationship. We don't need the rules. We don't need the boundaries. We don't need the restrictions. And lehepech, the restrictions take us away from our connection. Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner wrote, the Vilna Gaon's great Talmud, wrote a great, great, great sefer called Nefesh HaChaim. And it's a complicated sefer, and there's a lot of Kabbalah in it. But if I had to summarize the primary thesis of the Nefesh HaChaim in one or two sentences, he was essentially addressing the importance of keeping the halacha, that if you want your relationship to God, it cannot be based exclusively on your emotion and on your feeling, but it has to be based on God's own terms. God defines the terms of the relationship. Now, you read that today and you think, well, that's obvious, you got to keep halacha. But the truth is, a lot of things are obvious only because they've been taught for hundreds of years by these Svarim. In early Hasidus, there actually was an orientation that emotion can take the place of halachic detail, and in things like New Age spirituality today, that's exactly what's going on. In countless movements, including even some movements that ostensibly go by the name Orthodoxy. I don't want to get into the details of that, open Orthodoxy and the like. But you understand the you understand the problem here. Rav Chaim Volozhiner gives an example. Rav Chaim Volozhiner gives an example of, let's imagine it's Pesach. Now we just had Pesach. And the person is dead tired. His wife is dead tired at the night of the Seder. So let's say the person would say the following. You know, the whole purpose of the Seder is to feel freedom, to feel redemption, to feel closeness to God. But I'm going to fall asleep at the Seder. I want to go through the Seder in like a half an hour and get it over with. What type of Seder is that? So I'll tell you what. I'll go to sleep early tonight. And tomorrow after Shul, I'll make the greatest Seder you'd ever imagine. Kavana and Iyun and learning the Haggadah and inspiration. After all, isn't inspiration the most important thing about religion? So why should I do a lousy Seder Pesach night if I can do a great Seder Pesach day? But that's absurd, because you might have a great experience Pesach day, but you're not doing God's will. You're not going to connect to God in a way that God didn't define. Now, I just want to tell you something about how life imitates art, and sometimes in an absurd way. Rav Chaim Volozhiner used this as an example of an absurdity that everybody would understand is absolutely crazy. Right? That's what he's communicating. Well, I gave this mashal once to a class of people who were not yet religious, and a woman raised her hand and said, you know, that's exactly what we did. We couldn't get the family together for the Seder night, so we decided to make the Seder the Shabbos after Pesach, when everybody came, and it was wonderful, great Seder. So, it's an amazing thing. What Rav Chaim Volozhiner gave as an example of the inconceivable actually becomes the real. It's what.
So you know my aunt.
Oh, okay. That's right. So the reductio ad absurdum becomes the ein hachinami. It actually happens. But that's Rav Chaim's point. So here, let's go through the Noahide Sites and see how everything works out that way. So essentially, this goes back to my earlier point. That's why the laws about not entering the Holy of Holies are connected to the deaths of Aaron's sons. Al yavo b'chaleis ala kodesh. You want to approach God, but you got to follow the rules. Hashem has rules. Hashem has procedures. Hashem has limitations. You can't just say, I want to connect to God in whatever way I want. Halacha defines the parameters of that relationship. Yes, love of Hashem, reverence of Hashem, not doing mitzvahs coldly or mechanically is extremely important. God forbid, no one is recommending a Yiddishkeit devoid of passion and feeling. But it can't be zara, it can't be foreign. It has to be integrated within the observance of halacha. So now let's go through the list just to show it relatively quickly. So Noahide Sites took wine. Once again, since according to them, the most important thing was the intensity of emotional feeling. So they figured if wine enhances the emotions, let's go with it. Although alcohol is actually a depressant, but at least in the short term, it makes you happier. They didn't want to get married. They took the position that physicality, like celibacy, just like like the Catholic Church, they took the position that family, marriage, sexual intimacy take us away from holiness. We want a holiness that is separated from the physical world. Well, that may be your ideal in theory, but that's not God's ideal. God's ideal in the very first mitzvah of the Torah: be fruitful and multiply. And you don't sanctify God by escaping physicality. You embrace it and you elevate it. Paskening halacha in the presence of Moshe and Aaron. Right, that's the third one. So here I would suggest the following. Moshe and Aaron are symbolic of what you might call the received order. Right? Moshe and Aaron are the transmitters of the halachic system. When they would paskin in front of Moshe and Aaron, it's not just the technical violation of paskening in front of Moshe and Aaron, but it's a certain attitudinal shift in which they're basically saying, let's forget about the rules and let's focus on the feeling and the emotion. Similarly, when they said, when will these old people die? That essentially means, let the rule-oriented order pass. And by the way, let me point out that in some ways, this was the very argument of Christianity, without going into arichas. That is the notion that faith, passion, feeling can replace the laws of the Torah, replace the halachic system. Not wearing garments. Think about the role of clothing. Clothing is a barrier, right? It separates me from you. If we're totally nude, we're exposed to each other. They didn't want barriers in there. So again, taking off clothing is symbolic of the idea, I don't want a barrier between me and God. I want there to be a direct connection. Gazing at the Shekhinah, Matan Torah. Once again, not obeying the barriers. Looking, gazing, going into levels that you're not supposed to go into. And even the sin of the golden calf was the attempt to make God into an image that we could perceive in a physical way. Meaning to say, making God in our image, in a tangible physical way as an intermediary. So B'kitzer, I gave you this long list of Averos, and I then asked the question, it's not Eish Zara? The answer is, they are manifestations of Eish Zara. If Eish Zara means a displaced passion that is not rooted in halachic subservience and recognition of boundaries, all of these Aveirot are connected to the Eish Zara. And that is why, once again, in Acharei Mos, Al Yavo B'chaleis El HaKodesh. There's a famous thought, I think it's from the first Ger Rebbe, the Chidushei Harim. All of you know the famous Medrash that before Hashem gave the Torah to the Jewish people, He went to all the nations of the world, and he offered them the Torah first. He knew how the story would come out, but he had to go through the motions of offering the Torah first. And all the nations then asked, well, what's written in your Torah? And Hashem gave them a mitzvah that was very hard for them. Hashem said to one nation, don't steal, can't do that. Don't kill, can't do that, etc. In other words, they were tested. Hashem gave them a mitzvah that would be hard for them, and they said no. What test did he give the Jewish people to kind of see if they were sincere? Now, one simple answer, I really don't understand the question that well, because the Jewish people didn't ask for a test. They said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will obey the Torah before we know what's in there. But the Chedush Yerim says, he wants to make it a parallel. If Hashem gave Yishmael a mitzvah that was very hard for them, and Hashem gave Esav a mitzvah that was very hard for them, what did he give the Jewish people that would be hard for them, and nevertheless they accepted ahead of time? So he says, it was the commandment to separate from Mount Sinai. If you remember, the Torah says, when the divine presence comes down on the mountain, you must be at a distance from the mountain. Do not approach the mountain. And that's a very profound idea, that our relationship to God has to be so reverential that there's a certain boundary. And the Chedush Yerim says, for a Yid to be separated from God, that's the hardest thing. That is as hard as a Yishmael not stealing and an Esav not killing. To observe boundaries is what is hard for a Jew. And this is actually the dichotomy that exists in Judaism. If you take a bracha, let's take a very simple bracha that you make on water. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, shehakol niyeh bidvaro. Blessed art you, God, the King of the universe, that all came into existence through His word. Do you see the grammatical anomaly in the bracha? The bracha starts off in second person. Blessed art you, God. But it ends in third person. It should have said, Baruch atah Hashem, shakol niyeh bidvarecha. Everything came into existence by your word. So in the middle of the bracha, you're switching from directly addressing Hashem to indirectly addressing Hashem in the third person. In Diktuk, that's called nochach. Nochach is you're speaking to somebody as a you, versus nistar, as if he's not there. So the Abu Dram says, this is because in every bracha, we encapsulate two relationships that we have with God. On one hand, God is close to us. He is loving. He is our friend. He is our protector. We have an intimate relationship with Him that we can turn to Him at all times, to pray, even to converse. Get the habit of talking to Hashem. That's the atah. It's as if Hashem is with me. Again, the fancy theological term for that is the immanence of Hashem. The feeling that Hashem is with me at all times. And that is the feeling that is connected to Ava, to love. But then we also have to recognize God's omnipotence, His power. He is beyond us. You see? And that is what creates awe and reverence and yira. And that's the nistar. That's, again, the fancy theological term is the transcendence of God. So in every bracha, we encapsulate in a short little bracha the relationship of love and the relationship of fear, awe, the immanence of Hashem, the transcendence of Hashem. And that's what's encapsulated in the Eish Sarah problem. The Eish perceives Hashem's love and has a tremendous desire to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the Yira says, you got to follow the rules. You got to follow the regulations. Now, there is an idea that Rav Tzadok talks about that is potentially so controversial that actually it was censored from the earlier editions of his books, from his notebooks. Later they published it. So I may get in big trouble for saying it. That's kind of the disadvantage as these shiurim get disseminated. It used to be I only was talking to the people in the room, no big deal. Now I gotta always be thinking about this. But I do want to share it because it's a powerful idea, but I want to emphasize it is not for implementation. And that is, Rav Tzadok actually suggests that it might be possible that Nadav and Avihu were actually right vis-a-vis themselves, meaning it may be the case that certain individuals can have their private relationship with God, and the Torah may not apply to them because they're on such a madrega that they don't have to follow the rules, just like the son of a king may not have to follow the rules for royal access. But the reason they were taken from the world is not so much that they were punished, but they could not possibly be a role model or a leadership for the rest of Klal Yisrael. So God took them because that's not what leadership is. Because we have to live by the Torah. The private deals that exceptional individuals can construct is between them and God, but it's not for anyone else to even be aware of. Now you can see this is an extremely controversial idea because all sorts of people could try to make these arguments for themselves. All I can say is that in 999,000 out of a million, they're going to be wrong, right? But there may be such a madrega, and based on that idea, Dasna and Aviram were taken not because they were sinners, but they were taken because they had reached a level of righteousness that was beyond the confines of Olam Hazeh. And therefore they could no longer be part of this world because they were living on a level that was beyond this world. So this is actually, I'll just end here, this is actually the big challenge that we have as religious Jews. Because you see the problem on both ends of the spectrum. There are Jews who are spiritual, who are joyous, who love Hashem, who want to connect to Hashem. But sometimes they feel impatient with the details of halacha that they regard as an impediment, as Nadav and Avihu, the Eish Sarah. But then you have the opposite. People who are sticklers to detail, but without passion, without enthusiasm, kind of operating on automatic pilot, dead inside. And that's also a tremendous loss. And somehow we have to find in our Yiddishkeit a way to keep the passion and enthusiasm, but within the boundaries of the relationship that Hashem structures, to feel the loving immanence of the Creator, which is Avas Hashem, but to also recognize the transcendence of Hashem, and therefore the need to be obedient and faithful to His commandments. So may HaKadosh Baruch Hu help us to try to achieve both of those goals, each person according to their madrega. But thank you, and have a good evening.
Yeah.